I know I said I would have this video out a week ago, but I went on holiday. Anyway, Parker is often complimented on how clean his prints are, so I'm going to let you in on a secret. We're not some 3D printing geniuses who get all of our models perfect first time. Parker in fact just takes great care to prep his prints properly. It can be time consuming, but it is so worth it for that final result. So whether you print yourself or you buy unpainted model kits, today I'm going to help you get the perfect pieces ready for painting. The first step to getting prints looking so nice is supporting in a way that reduces holes, scratches and voxel lines, whilst also allowing for the cleanest fit. If you want some tips on this, we have just put together a supporting guide over on our Patreon for both free and paid members to enjoy. So do check that out and hopefully it'll be a good starting point for you. So Parker always starts with a dry fit so he can get a feel for what pieces might need some help. I see a lot of people jump straight to the step of gap filling when they have small seams like you can see here, but really for the most part, if your model is well designed, well cut, the pieces are appropriately supported, have no warping, and they're cleaned up pretty well, the fit should just be pretty clean. You can see on these Superman pieces it's already pretty good, but it just needs a little help to be perfect. So one of the things we discuss in that supporting guide is using break sphere supports. We personally prefer to be left with a small nub from supports as opposed to a small crater. As you can see here, these are super easy to slice off with a scalpel, and they're particularly vital on textured pieces as you don't want holes that you're unable to fill and match the texture of. The scalpel is also useful to start achieving a clean fit by slicing any bumps on connecting surfaces. Sometimes you are forced to support on connecting pieces and this can leave them a little deformed, so we want to get them nice and flat again. To do this, after slicing with the scalpel, Parker then goes through and sands the pegs and connecting surfaces. In some spots, he even uses his Dremel tool to make the process quick and easy, as well as helping to get to difficult spots. Next thing we're going to look at is filling small holes, divots, craters, whatever you want to call them. These can happen for a variety of reasons. Sometimes your exposure times might be off, which can be common if you're switching resins, can also be caused by walls being a bit too thin, or if your support settings are not quite right, the removal of them may leave a crater behind. Although I think for these holes on Superman is due to the resin not being mixed properly and it possibly having air traps in the vat. Superman here was printed with Resi 1's THHR, which is a lovely resin, but it can separate easily, so it really benefits from being mixed again after a plate is printed, so these holes are totally on us. This small crater on Mel V, I think was just due to the support type. I can't quite remember anymore, it's a bit of an older one. But this is another reason we use the break sphere supports now, as heavy supports are prone to leaving small holes. If your prints are affected by any of these types of holes, don't worry. You don't need to reprint, we can get them fixed up nice and easy. For this, we like to use this product, Mr. Hobby's Dissolved Putty. It's a really great consistency and it flows into gaps nicely without being too runny and spilling over. Use a cheap brush for this application though, not a nice one. A bulk of cheap brushes is useful for your toolbox for a variety of reasons, so I definitely recommend having some to hand. Just carefully apply like this by dabbing into the hole. You can use IPA to wipe off any overspill or to level it if you wish. This putty touch dries very quickly, but they advise an overnight dry to fully cure. Once it is fully cured, it can be sanded as well if the application wasn't quite flush. Now to look at one of the most common imperfections in 3D printing, we're going to fix some small scratches, voxel lines and layer lines. Now to demonstrate the difference we have these examples. All of these can happen for a variety of reasons again. Similar to the holes, scratches may be caused by resin, or maybe there's some sort of light obstruction on your vat or screen. Voxel lines are super common, especially on the tops of shoulders and boobs. Anti-aliasing can mitigate these pretty well, but if you're unable to slice in a format that supports AA, then you may see these often. Print orientation is a really good place to start to reduce these, so again, check out that supporting guide for more discussion on that. Finally, layer lines like this. If you start getting these, it's possible your settings are wrong, maybe you're getting a motor issue or the axis needs greasing. For us here on this occasion, the rails were no longer running smoothly, so we replaced them and started getting a nice smooth prints again. So again, these issues can be fixed. This is one of those things where you need to balance your time, your schedule, the resin costs, and make the decision for yourself about whether it's going to be best to fix or reprint. For this very small scratch here on Superman's boot, we knew it would be an easy fix. So Parker grabs his tub of Mr. Hobby 1000 Aqueous Surfacer and applies with a cheap brush. For the voxel lines we had on Superman's shoulder, he applied a bit more generously across the affected area. Most recently, we printed this very big dragon and had some parts affected by layer lines due to issue with our rails on our M3 Max printer. Since this was a large piece, it was going to be costly in resin and a disruption to our tight print schedule, so we opted to fix it rather than reprint. You can see here how Parker has generously applied the surfacer across this large area. This product is touch dry in about 20 minutes, but they advise 4 hours to fully cure. However, I will say we have often sanded after around an hour of drying without any issue. Once the application is dry, we go through a wet sanding process which helps to smooth it all out. It might sometimes look like you're removing a lot of the surfacer, but it does remain in the voxel lines. Once you get to the priming stage, you're really going to see the effects. It is also fine to apply this over your primer, so if you've primed and then notice voxel lines, feel free to start this process of fixing at this point. Our first layer of primer is often not the last layer. Now we're going to move on to gap filling. Whether you have big gaps or small gaps to fill, Milliput is great. Parker uses the silver grey Milliput in particular. First, he uses it to fill holes in this very large piece. Sometimes you may find yourself needing to place drain holes in visible places, maybe to do with suction cups, or maybe just because it needs to be more effectively drained of resin whilst printing. Anyway, this large piece has a couple of small holes, so he mixes up some Milliput. He rolls it out into this sausage type shape and pushes it into the hole, breaking it off as flush to the surface as possible. To make sure you don't have big lumps to sand down once dry, you can use the scalpel to slice off flush to the piece. Another great thing about Milliput is that it can be smoothed really easily with water, and we're going to use that method on this next gap. Gap filling seams like this is probably one of the most common issues people come across. We all hate sanding, so let's try to get these filled with minimal sanding needed after. As I mentioned earlier, proper supporting can help minimize these seams. However, sometimes no matter how well you've supported a piece, there's going to be a seam if the model isn't quite cut in the best way possible. We recently came across this issue with Maleficent, which unfortunately just had the bottom of her skirt cut, leaving a pretty clear visible line. After Parker did all he could to make the connection as clean as possible with the scalpel and wet sanding on the connecting surfaces, he was left with the model looking like this. So mix up your Milliput in small amounts. This is a common reason why people end up with a thick seam that needs lots of sanding. You mix up a big batch thinking you're going to need it all, and you really just don't. This stuff does go further than you think. As he carefully applies it all along the seam of the piece, he starts to introduce water and smooths out the putty application. Here it begins to look super messy, but don't worry, it's doing the job and all of this extra residue can just be easily removed. Once the Milliput has had 2 to 4 hours to dry, Parker is now ready to wet sand. This helps to smooth out the applied putty even more than the water smoothing. Little check-in on the piece post-wet sanding, and he's now going to opt for a finer layer of smoothing. He gets out the aqueous surfacer that we just looked at previously and applies it onto the seams. As we touched on earlier, this goes through the wet sanding process as well after drying. Here you can see in the final model how good it looks after going through this lengthy process. Now we've touched on sanding a few times throughout this video, but let's just take a little moment to look at these wet sanding sponges he uses. At one point long ago, Parker did use sandpaper, but probably ran into the same issue as a lot of you here have experienced, and that is how quickly it will disintegrate when used with water. So he uses these wet sanding sponges. He has a few different grits, with the lower number being more abrasive and given a rougher sand, and the higher numbers being softer and given a smoother finish. These sponges are a really great balance between soft, allowing you to flex them around shapes, but also rigid, enough to do some of the flatter surfaces. The sponges really help to hold some moisture too, with the added water helping to keep the sanding process smooth as well as tidier. It doesn't create dust in the same way dry sanding does, instead it more just leaves a residue to easily rinse or wipe off. With the prints all nice and clean, we can get to some priming. Now Parker gets asked about his painting handles a lot on stream, and I always forget to mention them here in YouTube videos. So, Parker designed these cork holders a couple years back and he's been using them ever since. They're really stable for holding the pieces whilst drying, as well as acting as a brace to keep them steady during painting. He uses them with acrylic or metal rods inserted into a matching size drain hole. We recently listed the STL on our website, so check the description if you want to try them out. For most pieces, the first step of priming is using Vallejo Panzer Grey primer through the airbrush. However, for pieces like this dragon wing and these flames that we were working on earlier on in the video, he will sometimes use a rattle can filler primer just to help out a little bit more with smoothing out those surfaces. If he does opt to do that, he then brings it back in and it goes through the Vallejo Panzer Grey primer stage. After getting an all-over coverage, he gives this part a grayscale shade. For this, he uses neutral grey ink through the airbrush. This shading process allows the dark grey primer to remain in the recesses of the model and appear as shadows. Next, Parker will sometimes go through a dry brushing stage. Parker has a selection of dry brushes, but mostly he will use cheap makeup brushes in this process. He uses different sizes depending on what size part he is dry brushing. First thing to do is moisten the bristles slightly by touching them to a damp sponge. The sponge inside the wet palette works perfectly for this. Then thoroughly wipe the brush until you can barely feel moisture remaining. Next, he uses a tile to help completely coat the dry brush in titanium white. Then Parker uses a painting rag to now remove it all back off again, wiping until just a small trace of paint remains. Be sure to move and rotate the brush in all directions at this stage so that no significant deposits of paint remain hidden within the bristles. Now brush over the parts and you'll start to see textures come back to life. If the brush is correctly loaded, you'll see that paint comes off with minimal pressure. This extra step helps act as underpainting for shadows and highlights, as he will then use multiple transparent layers in his painting process. Another occasion his priming may look different is when he is painting OSL. You can see here on the Rumi model, he even turns to his white ink from Liquitex to create the brightest shades, indicating where the light will be at its brightest point. Do check out our videos on Viego or Rumi if you want to see a bit more of this. And this brings us to the end of our prep and prime video. If this was helpful, please subscribe, like the video, leave a little comment, maybe let us know if you use any of these products already and which of them you are excited to try out. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, a special thanks to our patrons on screen. We could not be making these videos without your support. We will catch you all in the next one.